Ma'am, this badge says the truck you're towing is an FBI evidence van.
Oh, I didn't know. This changes everything.
The morning my moving truck almost disappeared wasn't stormy, but the tension in the air felt electric, like the crackle before thunder. I'd just stepped out of my new lakeside house with a mug of coffee, savoring the crisp bite of autumn air, when the rumble of a diesel engine echoed down the cul-de-sac. At first, I thought it was another neighbor heading to work early. But when the massive tow rig turned onto my driveway, its orange lights flickering against the pale sky, my gut twisted. After 15 years of service with the FBI, I'd learned to trust that sixth sense, the one that whispers when something's about to go sideways. And today it screamed. The side of the rig read Precision HOA Towing, bold and smug, like it belonged to a sheriff of asphalt. Behind the wheel sat a guy with mirrored sunglasses and a neon vest, clearly sent on a mission. Only 2 days had passed since I'd arrived with my boxes. My life stacked in cardboard, my badge and sidearm tucked safely away. I'd chosen this neighborhood precisely for its serenity, tree-lined streets, a glinting lake beyond the maples, and homes that looked like a Norman Rockwell painting come alive. It was supposed to be my quiet chapter after years of chasing fugitives and sitting through endless debriefings. But apparently, even a federal badge couldn't shield me from a homeowners association with a taste for power plays that I'd been warned, vaguely, by the realtor about a strict HOA president named Karen Hollings, but I'd laughed it off. I'd faced drug cartels, cybercrime rings, even a malicious standoff in Wyoming. How bad could a middle-aged woman with a clipboard be? Yet as the tow truck idled like a predator outside my garage, I spotted her across the street. Karen stood on her perfect front lawn in a scarlet windbreaker, a file folder clutched like a royal decree. Even from 50 feet away, her expression was pure triumph. The look of someone convinced they'd caught a criminal red-handed. The absurdity hit me. My moving truck hadn't even been unloaded completely. Yet she was already summoning enforcement. The HOA rulebook, apparently thicker than some case files I'd handled, must have some clause against overnight parking. And sure enough, taped to my mailbox was a bright yellow notice with the HOA crest screaming, "Violation. Unauthorized vehicle storage." The ink was still wet. The coffee in my hand went cold as adrenaline surged. This wasn't about a truck. It was about control. Karen didn't know or care who I was. She saw a newcomer who hadn't knelt at her throne, and she pounced. The tow driver hopped out, boots crunching on gravel, and began circling the moving truck like a shark. I stayed calm on the outside, a skill honed from years of interrogations, but my mind raced. Inside that truck, among the boxes labeled kitchen and garage tools, were sealed containers logged as federal evidence, items temporarily under my personal custody pending transfer. Nothing sensitive enough to trigger alarms at HQ, but still, the chain of custody had my name on it. Losing track of those boxes, even for a moment, could nuke my spotless record. The idea of explaining to internal affairs that a suburban HOA had impounded an FBI evidence shipment was almost laughable. Almost Karen's smug posture across the street was fuel on a slow-burning fire. She wasn't just enforcing a bylaw. She was performing for her invisible audience, establishing dominance over the newest resident before my boxes had settled. Around the cul-de-sac, curtains twitched. Neighbors peeked out like wildlife, sensing a predator. They wouldn't intervene. People rarely do at first. HOA bullies thrive on that silence. The way playground tyrants feed on kids who look away. I took a slow breath, the way I had in 100 tense moments before, letting the lake breeze cool my face. The setting was beautiful. Maple leaves trembling gold, sunlight skipping over the water, but beauty can't mask a threat. I knew bullies well. They always press hardest when they think their target is isolated. But I wasn't about to roll over. Not here. Not today. Instead of shouting or panicking, I stepped toward the truck, coffee still in hand, and began mentally cataloging Karen's misuse of authority, the tow driver's company name, the precise time stamped on my watch. Details win battles, not noise. I could almost hear my old supervisor's voice. Control the scene. Matt. Facts beat fury. What Karen didn't know was that she'd picked a fight with someone who not only respected rules, but knew exactly how to wield them. The tow driver reached for the chain. Sunlight glinting off polished steel, and I caught a flash of my FBI badge tucked in a box through the truck's back window. My heart thudded. If those chains tightened, I wouldn't just lose a moving truck. I'd risk a scandal, my career, and the very peace I'd chased to this lakeside haven. Somewhere deep inside, a switch flipped. This wasn't just about a truck anymore. It was about standing firm, even when your knees are shaking. The moment stretched as the tow driver's hand hovered near the winch, and I could feel the subtle shift in the air that always precedes a confrontation. Years of fieldwork had taught me to read micro-expressions and power dynamics, and everything about Karen's rigid posture across the street screamed anticipation, like a cat poised over a cornered mouse. But this time the mouse had claws. I stepped deliberately between the truck and the rig, the gravel crunching under my boots, and the driver hesitated just enough to buy me precious seconds. The lake glimmered behind me, tranquil and indifferent. And that very contrast sharpened the absurdity of the situation. A neighborhood meant for peace was about to become a battlefield of petty authority and buried secrets. I could almost hear the faint hum of whispers behind closed curtains as neighbors watched, some likely relieved it wasn't them in the crosshairs, others silently rooting for me because they'd been there before. I knew then that Karen's reign of intimidation was larger than this single tow attempt. It was a pattern woven into the community's fabric, one that thrived on fear and compliance. Instead of reacting with anger, I let my mind shift into investigative mode, the same methodical gear that had carried me through countless operations. I replayed the HOA bylaw packet I'd skimmed the night before while unpacking, a packet as thick as a field manual and about as forgiving. Somewhere in those pages, I remembered, was a clause about vehicle storage that allowed reasonable accommodation for new residents during moving. Karen was counting on the fact that most people wouldn't remember or challenge that fine print. Bullies always gamble on ignorance. My years spent dissecting legal codes and procedural loopholes gave me an edge she couldn't predict. I could feel the old thrill of strategy stirring, the same one I'd felt tailing suspects or setting up undercover stings. Except now the battlefield was a sleepy lakeside neighborhood. Instead of a city alley, the tow driver adjusted his gloves and looked uncertain. I pictured the chain of custody forms in my desk drawer back at the field office, my signature anchoring every line. The evidence boxes inside that truck contained fragments of a fraud investigation, nothing headline-grabbing, but enough to trigger internal audits, if misplaced. The mere idea of explaining to my superiors that an HOA zealot had caused a breach made my stomach tighten. The stakes were invisible to everyone else, but to me they were enormous, and that sense of hidden pressure only sharpened my focus. I cataloged every sensory detail, the angle of the sun for a potential time-stamp photo, the truck's license plate reflecting in a nearby window for corroboration, the distinctive scarlet of Karen's jacket for witness descriptions later. The habits of a field agent die hard, and in this moment, they became my silent allies. Karen's smug presence loomed like a storm cloud. She wasn't yelling yet, but her squared shoulders and faint, self-satisfied smirk were louder than any words. To her, this was already a victory parade. I could almost see the narrative she'd crafted. The new guy humbled, the queen reaffirmed, the neighborhood reminded who held the scepter. What she didn't realize was that her eagerness had exposed her. By rushing to tow a legally parked moving truck without even a proper grace period, she had overplayed her hand. Power, I knew, was often an illusion sustained by bluster, and illusions shatter when pressed with facts. I let my breathing steady, letting the cool breeze from the lake calm my pulse as a plan formed. The tow driver's indecision was a crack in the armor, and all I needed was pressure applied in the right spot. That I thought of the stories whispered by neighbors the realtor, had hinted at but never fully revealed, quiet grievances about absurd fines for mismatched flower pots, whispered resentment about lawn inspections, even a rumor of an elderly couple who'd moved out after Karen demanded they remove a decades-old treehouse. Those stories weren't gossip anymore. They were context, proof that this wasn't an isolated overstep but part of a pattern. If I could hold the line now, perhaps others would find the courage to stop looking away. I tightened my grip on the coffee cup, its warmth grounding me as the tow rig's diesel engine idled impatiently. The neighborhood's perfect facades and manicured hedges seemed to fade, leaving only the raw power struggle at its core. And as I stood there, a former federal agent on a quiet street with golden leaves skittering across the pavement, I knew that Karen had just stepped into a trap of her own making, one she didn't even realize existed yet. The quiet chess match had begun, and I was more than ready to play the long game. By the time the weekend arrived, the undercurrent of tension in the neighborhood had evolved into a palpable buzz, like static before lightning. Karen's attempt to tow my truck had sparked more than annoyance. It had awakened dormant frustration in the residents who had long endured her tyranny in silence. Whispers reached me at the bait shop and the small coffee stand by the marina. Stories of fines for flower baskets deemed too whimsical, threats over mailboxes an inch off regulation height, and hushed complaints about her hosting late-night gatherings while chastising others for minor noise. It became clear that Karen's authority wasn't built on fairness or genuine care for the community. It was maintained through fear and fatigue. People tolerated her simply because challenging her seemed exhausting. But exhaustion could turn into quiet rebellion when someone else bore the brunt of her aggression and stood tall instead of folding. The more I unpacked boxes in my lakeside home, the more determined I became to unravel her grip on this place. My years in the bureau had taught me that bullies rely on isolation, and the surest way to dismantle them is to illuminate their hypocrisy. That I spent evenings at my kitchen table, a single lamp casting light over a growing folder of notes, photos, and HOA bylaws I had pulled apart line by line. The bylaw packet, once just an annoyance, now felt like a weapon I could wield. In Section 14, buried between mundane parking rules, was the very clause Karen had gambled I wouldn't read. Newly relocated residents were allowed a reasonable period to keep moving vehicles on the premises without penalty. Not only had she violated her own guidelines by attempting a tow on day 2, but cross-referencing the HOA meeting minutes revealed that her own luxury boat had remained overnight on association property more than a dozen times without approval. Even worse, I discovered her previous tow requests had been selectively enforced, never targeting her allies, only those she sought to intimidate. The pattern was glaring to anyone willing to look closely. What sealed my strategy was a visit to the county records office. While verifying my property documents, I cross-checked HOA enforcement logs and noticed an unregistered filing regarding Karen's personal storage shed that extended onto community land, something she had repeatedly warned others never to do. It was textbook hypocrisy, the kind of detail that, when exposed, would erode her authority in an instant. I could almost see the moment in my mind, her confidence faltering, the neighbors' eyes widening as they realized the Queen's castle stood on rotten planks. But this wasn't about gloating. It was about protecting my integrity, my career, and the simple peace I'd sought when I chose this house. The FBI evidence boxes still sat neatly sealed in my garage now, their labels crisp, a silent reminder of what was at stake if I allowed her pettiness to spiral into real consequences that I began to connect quietly with a few neighbors. Not with loud accusations, but with patient, fact-based conversations. Over beers with a retired firefighter 2 houses down, I shared the clause from the bylaws and watched his eyebrows rise. Over a fence chat with a young couple, I mentioned the shed encroachment and the boat violations, their eyes lighting with recognition. The Martins, an elderly pair with a reputation for kindness, admitted Karen had fined them last year for leaving their grandkids' bicycles on the driveway overnight. Each story was a thread, and together they formed a tapestry of discontent that had been hidden in plain sight. Even those who had once nodded politely at Karen began to see the possibility of change. The realization that her power was not absolute began to ripple through the cul-de-sac like a breeze across the lake on Saturday evening. As the sun melted into the horizon and the water caught fire with orange and rose reflections, I stood on my porch and considered the next move. The HOA's emergency meeting was scheduled for midweek. A meeting Karen had called to formally propose action against me for endangering property values. The irony was rich, but I couldn't rely on irony alone. Timing mattered. If I presented my findings too early, she might spin the narrative or intimidate the more hesitant neighbors back into silence. If I waited too long, she could push through penalties or escalate her tactics. The key was to let her walk confidently into her own trap, to let her hubris peak so that the fall would be undeniable. My plan crystallized. I would attend quietly, let her rant, and then, with calm precision, expose her violations one by one, not with anger but with incontrovertible evidence. And when the moment came, I'd be ready to trigger the final measure. contacting the towing service authorized to impound unregistered vehicles stored improperly on association property. The very tool she had tried to use against me would become the instrument of her undoing. That night, under a sky dusted with stars, the lake whispering softly against the shore, I felt the familiar steadiness that came before a decisive move in the field. This was no longer just a neighborhood squabble or a parking dispute. It was about standing firm against someone who believed power made her untouchable. And as the cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the open window, I knew that the quiet calm of this place, the peace I had sought after years of high-stakes investigations, would only be possible if I saw this. Through to the end, the night of the emergency, HOA meeting arrived wrapped in the kind of deceptive calm that always seems to precede upheaval. The community hall smelled faintly of fresh coffee and old wood polish, its folding chairs lined in perfect rows beneath fluorescent lights that hummed quietly overhead. Neighbors trickled in wearing guarded expressions, their voices low with curiosity and tension. Outside, the lake mirrored a pale moon, serene and detached from the storm about to break within these walls. I arrived early, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, the same discipline that had carried me through stakeouts and evidence reviews. The binder of notes and photographs I carried under my arm felt heavier than its actual weight, not from burden, but from certainty. I found a chair near the side wall, scanning the room with the same practiced awareness I had used in briefing rooms and surveillance vans, noting each face and whispered exchange. The Martins offered me a small nod of encouragement, while others pretended to study the community bulletin board rather than meet my eyes. Karen swept in like a weather front, her navy blazer crisp, her clipboard clutched to her chest as though it contained a royal decree. She radiated authority in the way only someone who has never truly been challenged can. For a brief moment, her self-assured smile reminded me of defendants who had once strutted into court convinced they were untouchable. I watched her move among the chairs, greeting loyalists with a hand on a shoulder here, a whispered aside there, planting the idea that this night would be her victory lap. As the meeting began, she launched into her practiced monologue about maintaining standards, preserving property values, and the supposed dangers of outsiders disrespecting their rules. My name came early, her tone laced with false concern as she painted my moving truck as a hazard to the neighborhood's harmony. Murmurs rippled through the audience, some sympathetic to her narrative, others shifting uncomfortably as if suspecting there was more to the story. I waited, letting her confidence crest like a wave nearing its peak. Then, when the room's energy had coalesced around her performance, I rose from my chair with measured calm. The eyes of the cul-de-sac turned toward me, and for a heartbeat, the hall seemed to hold its breath. I laid the binder on the front table, opened it with deliberate precision, and began revealing the documented violations, not with dramatic accusations, but with clear, factual evidence. The bylaw clause granting new residents grace periods for moving vehicles, highlighted and tabbed. Photographs of Karen's own boat moored repeatedly on HOA property without approval. County records showing her unregistered storage shed infringing on communal land. The pattern unfolded before their eyes, a tapestry of hypocrisy they could no longer dismiss. As pages turned and evidence accumulated, gasps replaced murmurs, and whispers became pointed glances exchanged among neighbors. Karen's composure faltered, the practiced smile slipping for the first time as she realized the narrative was no longer hers to control. The culmination came with the final piece. The official HOA enforcement clause authorizing impoundment of unregistered vehicles stored illegally. The same clause she had cited against me was now her undoing. With the paperwork already filed and the towing service waiting outside on standby, the weight of her authority evaporated. The sound of diesel engines approaching from the lot outside cut through the tense silence like a judge's gavel. When the tow crew entered with their clipboards, confirming the order to remove the unregistered boat moored on association property, the room erupted in a chorus of astonishment and hushed laughter. Karen's expression collapsed into disbelief, and the hall filled with the quiet satisfaction of neighbors who had endured her rule for too long. Through the windows, a procession of residents followed the tow operators to the shoreline, watching as the gleaming boat, the symbol of her dominance, was hitched and hauled away under the cold, fluorescent glow of the parking lot lights. The fallout was swift and final. In the days that followed, Karen's attempts to regain control fizzled like damp matches. Appeals went unanswered, emergency meetings were ignored, and whispers of a vote of no confidence grew into action. By week's end, she was removed from her post, her influence broken as surely as her reputation. The same neighbors who had once tiptoed around her now openly shared their relief, some even laughing for the first time in months without glancing over their shoulders. The Martins brought over a pie, saying they finally felt free to hang their wind chimes again. The retired firefighter planted sunflowers along his driveway without fear of a citation. Even the young couple across the street, once timid, invited friends for a barbecue that lasted late into the night. Music drifting softly over the water without anyone worrying about a knock on the door. For me, the victory was never about humiliating Karen. It was about reclaiming the peace I had moved here to find. Each morning afterward, stepping onto my porch with coffee in hand, I felt the stillness I had been seeking. The lake stretching out under the dawn, the maples whispering in the breeze, the weight of vigilance finally lifting from my shoulders. The FBI evidence boxes were delivered without incident to their proper chain of custody. My record remained spotless. And the neighbors now greeted me not as an outsider, but as a quiet defender who had reminded them of their own agency. And as autumn deepened, painting the shoreline in crimson and gold, I understood the deeper lesson in all of this. Power built on intimidation is fragile. It crumbles the moment someone refuses to be afraid. Standing firm isn't about shouting the loudest or striking first. It's about preparation, patience, and the courage to act when the moment comes. Karen's downfall wasn't my triumph alone. It was a collective exhale from a community that had forgotten its strength. And in the quiet that followed, beneath the rustle of leaves and the soft lap of water against the dock, I knew that the life I'd fought to build here would finally be the peaceful chapter I'd been searching for all along.